I've been working on the philosophy of consciousness for some time. There have been many lectures, and there will eventually be a book. And so what I was hoping to do is put this discussion of the integral paradigm in the context of the philosophy of consciousness in general. And this means to have an overview of what has been thought more generally about this question. How do we know anything in the first place? And among those things that we think we know, how much of it is really there? So those objects that the prajnana and the samjnana apprehend, which become internalized concepts and notions that we comprehend, of this process of so-called consciousness, how much of it do we really understand the process of that phenomenon of becoming aware of things? Usually that's the most common definition of consciousness, being aware of things. And to what extent is our awareness of things really a representation of what is there in reality? So if you've studied philosophy at all, you will know that today, in most schools of philosophy, we are absolutely sure that those things that we hold in our consciousness are not really there. Philosophy today doesn't believe that we know reality at all. So if we look back in the history of Western philosophy, what we'll find is that Plato dealt with these questions in great detail, and periodically throughout history they have been dealt with more or less on the Platonic paradigm in the West. And similarly in the East, there are many schools of philosophy that have developed throughout the millennia, which will be based more or less on these paradigms that we've been hearing about. So this is a very old question. It has a very deep tradition. It is maybe the fundamental question that the mind has. It's a question about itself. How does it work, and can we rely on it? Does it give us the information that we need to function successfully in the world? And many of us who are aware of the problems in the world today, the most prevalent ones, would answer that question negatively. This mind does not give us the information that we need in order to function successfully in the world. But it gives us the information that we need to achieve certain things. This mind is a practical mind, and it's a rational mind. So it evaluates things in relation to certain values that are adopted from age to age, and concludes that some forms of behavior would yield results based upon the deduction of how things are in relation to values. And this is called rationalism. We have some idea of what would be good, and we have some idea of why it's not the thing that we experience, and then we have some idea of how to move from one to the other. And there's a measurement in that process, a ratio between the good and the not quite good. And on the basis of that, we construct an understanding, and we apply that understanding practically. And this has been working for us for a few thousand years, and especially in the last few hundred years, in quite an extraordinarily efficient way. But then, if we think about our relationship to other species, and if we think in an evolutionary way about the connectedness of things, and we realize that our technologies are causing the rapid extinction of species by the day, and if we have some appreciation of the web of life, then we have to question whether what we're doing is really good and really successful in another context, in the context of our survival and the health of the planet. So then we start to ask ourselves again this perennial question. How do we know what we know, and is it true? So in Western philosophy, this became a very predominant concern around 1750. Around 1750, our civilization was really taking off. So for these 300 years, we have the human species in everywhere, but especially in the European Western Hemisphere, which has been benefiting the most from the practical mind, has really been seriously re-asking, re-interrogating this particular question. And so we have in the philosophy of the British empiricists, Locke and Hume especially, and Hobbes before them, they were trying to analyze what we were just hearing from the Sanskrit paradigm, the relationship between apprehension and comprehension. And enormous volumes of very brilliant speculation about this were written during that time, around between 1750 and 1850. And the way they thought about it was very similar to the way we think about it, or anyone has thought about it. Perception gives us information about the world inside us and outside us, and on the basis of those impressions, we group phenomena together according to similarities and differences, and by doing that, we are constructing concepts. And Konrad Lorenz in the 70s discovered that all animals do that, and he called it the principle of constancy phenomena. All animals perceive events, and then they retain similar events, and they deduce which events are in a category that gives pleasure and which events are in a category that gives pain. And we can observe this form of behavior in animals all the time. And even in the lowest one-celled organisms, we can observe behavior like this, which is mental. So the British empiricists decided that, in fact, we don't know anything about what we what's in the world. All we know is our perceptions of those things that are in the world. And then we think about those things and we arrive at similarities and differences that constitute concepts. And then we compare one set of concepts with another, for example, what's good and what's bad, and we arrive at a determination to act. So what we heard here was the vijnana and the ajnana are these comprehensive principles of consciousness, one of which knows the whole, the relationships and the now and the later and the before, the has been, the is and the will be, is grasped by the vijnana on another plane. And so everything has a coherent relationship to everything else in time. And because that's the case, according to that paradigm, we are able to anticipate from one set of stimuli and phenomena to the likelihood of another set, because we know that there's continuity in time. But we don't have that vijnana level of consciousness normally. Sri Aurobindo says we can evolve that because it's a fundamental principle of consciousness. And if it wasn't like that, we wouldn't know the relationship between any two things. And not only would we not know it, it wouldn't be there. Because this idea of knowing is not just something that happens in human consciousness. This principle of consciousness that we've been hearing about, which we were just told, is the principle that creates the thing that's known, just as it is the knowing of the thing that's created. It's the energy of being. That's what consciousness really is. So, lo and behold, around 1800, there was a German thinker named Hegel who didn't like the empirical view. He understood that this process of comprehension, which leads us in thought from the particular that we perceive to the category of generalities that we deduce, also gives us knowledge on a slightly higher level of universals. And those universals, like we're discussing several of them here, for example, sight, we can conclude by thinking that sight is a universal principle. And all the organs, all the sense organs that have evolved in all the species, quite independent of each other, there's something like 45 different phyla in evolution, all of which manifest seeing organs, but they are not related phylogenetically to each other. So sight is omnipresent in the animal kingdom. And if we think along the lines that we've been thinking this morning, we can understand that sight is a faculty of consciousness. And so then people like Hegel and then the phenomenologists who followed upon Hegel, and then the early 20th century philosophers of mind, such as Bergson and Whitehead and Sri Aurobindo, began to realize that consciousness is, as we hear from the Sanskrit scriptures, force. It isn't just a matter of knowing and perceiving and thinking, it's also force. Hegel came to this conclusion in 1800, and from that time on, all the philosophers that I know of have understood that that consciousness is this field that we are aware of. And if something were not there forcefully in time and space, we couldn't be aware of it. And the things that are present in time and space are related to each other in meaningful ways. There's not anything that happens that isn't a part of that web of relationships that we call life, for example. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen combine to form life because they are perfectly suited to each other for that purpose. And photons enable sight because sight is a principle of existence. It's not that the photons have evolved eyes, but the principle of sight has enabled photons to be a part of the elemental structure of existence, just like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And this is the anthropic principle, which you might have heard of. We are conscious today because all the forces of existence, the four strong forces and the weak forces and the speed of light and the amount of time that has lapsed since the Big Bang, all of those things are exactly what they had to be in order for us to be conscious today in the way that we are. If any of those fundamental principles had been different, we wouldn't be. We wouldn't have evolved in this way. That's the anthropic principle. So Hegel began to look deeply into this question and was the first one to write a book on consciousness, and described in great detail how we arrive at the awareness of universals. And I'll just run through one of my favorite examples. We are all aware of the phenomenon of oversized vehicles on the road in India today. Much bigger and faster and more comfortable than these roads and this economy can easily accommodate. But they have become very popular just in the last few years, actually. So now everyone wants to have an SUV. And if you drive down the street, you will see a Tata SUV and a Mahindra SUV and a Toyota SUV. And you might, if you're a car lover, you might have some ability to distinguish one from the other. But you will definitely know that they're not ambassadors and they're not rickshaws, and that they're blocking the road in front of you. So there's information that our apprehension gives us. And then, if we elevate that world of perceptions that we have through thinking about SUVs, it doesn't take us long to come to the conclusion that this is a phenomenon that belongs to that spectrum of phenomena known as transportation. So there are innumerable forms of transportation in the world today that were not there 100 years ago, and that serve us very well with respect to the ideal of connecting ourselves all over the world. So this global culture that we are a part of couldn't exist without all of those powerful means of transportation. And we wouldn't be here today. I don't see very many people that would be here today if it weren't for jet, air, transport, not to mention SUVs. The people who drive SUVs don't bother with these kinds of seminars because they don't know anything about thinking. They just know about driving, and not very much about that. Then we can begin to expand our awareness in a number of directions from this argument. And what are we doing then? We're thinking about universals. We're not thinking anymore about particulars. Now we're thinking about universals. And that's what we want to be doing. If we want to get out of our limited mental world, our world of sensation and perception and conventional values and automatic responses and being stuck in the everyday world that we identify with, then we must begin to think in terms of universals. And Sri Aurobindo says this very explicitly. We must analyze our minds, and we must universalize them if we want to move in the direction of the yoga of transformation. It's absolutely necessary. He's emphatic about that. So Hegel did this. And you know, philosophers are not who you think they are. Philosophers are those few human beings from time to time who really understand things. And philosophy means love of wisdom, and the purpose of obtaining wisdom is ultimately to obtain happiness, freedom. So the liberation of consciousness is the first and foremost goal of philosophy. And all the great philosophers throughout history have been focused on that. And we're not talking about, you know, how you get a job at Harvard teaching logic. But as was mentioned by Vladimir, almost in passing without any particular emphasis a while ago, he said to us, after he's explained these four higher faculties or principles of consciousness, he says, it's logical, isn't it? And yes, absolutely, that's what logic is. And it's knowing the relationship between particulars and universals. That is logic. And you can invent all kinds of mathematical systems for demonstrating the relationship between universals and particulars. And so Hegel wrote a book on logic in which he was speaking mainly about how we elevate our consciousness from particulars to concepts to universals, and then we start to see that a universal like transportation, which we cannot see in any particular form, this universal known as transportation is something that we grasp very concretely, and we can imagine a few examples of it. But we can also have a very vibrant sense of the power that is being expended on the globe now to achieve these corridors of connection, you know, in the air and on the ground and in the sea and everywhere. We can actually resonate with the principle of power itself. And we can give it the name Kali. And we can think about power in art and power in music and power in military and power in nature. We can become conscious of power as such. And Hegel says when we elevate our consciousness to that level, then it's a very small step to become aware of the absolute. Because the absolute is the absolute of power, the absolute of truth, the absolute of beauty, the absolute of proportionality and mutuality and feeling, that which unites everything to everything else, feeling. It's apprehension and comprehension, but you know, on the sensual level, it's feeling. So we feel things all the time, and that's a form of apprehension, and then we love them, and that's a form of, and we speak about them, we give them names. That's a form of comprehension. And so Hegel came to the conclusion, I think experientially, that the absolute is power manifesting itself through all of these different forms. Therefore, all of these different forms are the force of that power in time and space. And behind that power, and all of these forms of power and beauty, is the will, which is absolutely free. The free will of the absolute is what in Sanskrit is known as Chit Shakti. It is the power of consciousness that is the absolute in its manifestation. So these German thinkers came, and they did read Upanishads, by the way, but they read plenty of Plato, and they were just smart. And this was the beginning of an evolution of consciousness that's going on. And Sri Aurobindo read Hegel, and he read Plato in the original, and he read the British empiricists. And when he came to the Upanishads, he knew that all of those concepts that were resonant in the world of philosophy at that time, 1910, were they were there in the Sanskritic scriptures, and they were very alive in the recent history of philosophy. And it isn't really a matter of this school or this culture or that culture. These are fundamental realities that the human mind perceives. These are thoughts that are thought inevitably, because this is the world that thought is able to know. And it can only really think about things in the way that it does. And it thinks about things in the way that it does because, as we've heard, consciousness is a fundamental principle that emanates faculties, sight, hearing, speech, thought, word, fundamental emanations of the Supreme, the Absolute. And everything that exists is an embodiment of those fundamental emanations. Therefore, in the prana, the theory of prana that we haven't heard enough about yet, the qualities that things have are the qualities that we perceive, in fact. The German phenomenologists and the French phenomenologists in the 20th century agree with that. We are in the world, we are made of the same stuff. The qualities that things have are not just a kind of screening of vibrations that's done by the neuronal assemblies in the brain. The neuronal assemblies in the brain are resonating membranes that resonate with the qualities of things, which are then known by consciousness as the qualities of things. They are not qualities in our minds, they are qualities in things. And so the great phenomenologists, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and people in that school have written volumes and volumes about this fact of existence. Things are in consciousness because consciousness is in things. And it has nothing to do with our mind, actually. Our mind is just one of those resonating intermediaries. So we are all conscious of the same things because those are the things that exist. We can interpret in various ways, and this is one of our great pitfalls, because once we have framed a particular understanding of things, let's take, for example, evolutionary biology. So if we know a lot about evolutionary biology, and there is a lot to be known, and it's amazing and wonderful. So we study that, and that becomes a frame of understanding. And we don't give a damn anymore about what's happening to the microorganisms and the butterflies and the hippos and so on, because we have our frame of understanding. And we can manipulate that frame of understanding very successfully. We can modify genes, we can breed organisms, we can give really tough exams to the graduate students to make sure that they really know more facts than anybody else ever knew. And so this whole industry of our intellectual framing of things gets farther and farther away from the things themselves. And so, you know, one of the things that Hume laid down in 1750, which is still a cornerstone of animal research today, is that since we don't know whether that organism even exists or not, we don't know that it has any subsistence of its own. We don't know that it has continuity of its own. We see it today, we see it tomorrow, we saw it yesterday, so we construct continuity for it. But we don't really know what it is or whether it even really exists, except as we construct our ideas of it. So then the scientists today can feel very comfortable about doing animal research, because the animals are not self-existent beings with minds and with cosmic purposes. They are not organisms that need to be respected and loved because they are a form of the divine. We don't know what they are. We can dissect them, we can analyze their cells, you know, we can make them jump up and down, and we can extract their hormones and turn them into medicines, and that's in our interest to do that, and we never have to worry about what an animal is. So the phenomenologists have turned this around and have asked us for like 100 years now to think about the being of things. The being of things. And not just our impressions of some temporal aspects of things, not just our ideas of things, but things themselves. And, you know, Hume and Kant said, forget it, we can't know anything about things themselves. But then Hegel came along and said, not only can we know about things themselves, but we can know their direct relationship to the absolute, of which they are forces. And then then come the existential phenomenologists who began talking about the Vijnana, this thing which hasn't even manifested yet in the human mind. But they somehow know, they have an intuition that everything is related in a meaningful way. So Bergson's philosophy, for example, is about memory and time. And his writings are absolutely brilliant because he's a person who can think one thought for like 150 pages, and he never wavers. So, you know, if you're capable of thinking, then Bergson is your man. And he got a Nobel Prize, and it's very interesting that he wrote a book called Creative Evolution that was translated in 1907. It was translated in English in 1911. And then Sri Aurobindo wrote his work on evolution in 1912, 13, and 14. And there were never two writers, except maybe Aristotle and Plato, who were so close to each other in what they had to say. They're coming from one is coming from a scientific and the other from a mystical standpoint, but they're writing basically the same thing up to a point where they diverge. And where they diverge is where Sri Aurobindo says that this Vijnana, this ultimate principle of consciousness, is that which knows the relationships among everything beyond temporal change. It's atemporal. And that someday this will manifest in the human being. And he read Bergson, and he was fluent in French, and he refers to him in several of his books. But he says Bergson didn't know about supermind, and I think that's true. But Bergson's intuition was so vast and precise that he was actually describing it already without knowing about it. And then Whitehead comes along and says that the relationship between everything, from subatomic particles to our most sophisticated thought, is feeling. Everything feels the being of everything else. It doesn't necessarily get articulated in a very conscious way, but it's there. And if it weren't there, we wouldn't be able to function. Nothing would function the way that it does. Everything is conscious to the level that's appropriate to its level of energy and its place in the whole. So the result of my research during especially the past year, reading all of these things, and then a few years ago studying evolution quite thoroughly in relation to the integral paradigm of knowledge, tells me that today, in science in particular, in neuroscience and in neurophenomenology and in many schools of philosophy, those who are denying that we know anything, really, those who are insisting, again today, just like Hume 300 years ago, that all we know are the constructs of our minds. And at the same time, they are trying to, they say at least, they're trying to understand and define consciousness. They want to know what consciousness is, because this is the last unexplained aspect of existence. And so the neurophenomenologists are analyzing correlations between brain states and perceptions, and the speculative realists are analyzing correlations between ideas and feelings and qualia, and none of them are finding out what consciousness is. And they will not find out what consciousness is, because, and this is the conclusion that I've reached from reading all of these things, because consciousness is not a product of any set of phenomena. Consciousness is the principle of existence itself. And all of those processes and phenomena are it. There isn't anything else. And so consciousness has to be understood, if it's going to be understood at all, as not what our minds think, not what we perceive, not what we construct, not what animals feel. It is existence itself. And only because of that can Sri Aurobindo say the things that he has said, based upon the Upanishads. And in fact, that is what he says. Consciousness is the principle of being. Being is consciousness. And if we can understand the necessity of that, first of all, philosophically, then we can begin to think in terms of physics and biology and sociology and creativity. We can begin to think about how these faculties that we have and techniques that we have are products of consciousness, which in itself contains the essence of everything. And it is atemporal, it's infinite, it's absolute. And everything that is unfolding in time and space is its expression. And, even things like Auschwitz are products of that consciousness. And one of the things that we just read recently in our course that Sri Aurobindo says is that the essence of this absolute consciousness is delight. And the ethical mind, in its evolutionary development in human beings, makes all kinds of judgments based upon what it likes or doesn't like, and it can do things that it would not like to have done to itself, to others, because it's an advantage to do that. But if those things are done to it, it doesn't like those things. And so it's constantly, our human consciousness is constantly interpreting things on the basis of various perceptions that we have and values that our world holds and so on. And all the way back to Plato, there were those who responded to this way that we function by saying, you don't know what that is. You don't know that delight is the essence of things. You don't know that consciousness is the principle of things. You're just thinking all of these things because it's convenient for you to be able to maintain your aristocratic authority in society. And this is dogmatism. And yes, it is dogmatism. And the whole philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, based upon the Upanishads that we heard this morning, is dogmatic. But dogmatic only means that we are saying this because it's true. We're not saying this because of our social status and our superior spiritual status and our economic status and all of those things. This view of reality, for which Hegel was also accused of being dogmatic and bourgeois and so on, unfortunately, they're just plain true. And eventually, through the process of understanding, we arrive at these truths, which are necessary truths. And if they happen to be held by an elite, as they usually are, it's because that elite has had the leisure to explore in a detached way sufficiently to arrive at these truths. And yes, they generally do belong to an elite, and the Vedic paradigm belongs absolutely to an elite. But that doesn't mean that it can't become a norm of evolution. Because almost every value that has been held by an elite at one time or another has become a norm of evolution. So religion and ethics and whatever that you can think of in society that has become a dominant principle, a norm, began as the privilege of an elite. So there we are. When we think about the hierarchy of existence and consciousness is an absolute, and everything that happens in time and space will never be that absolute. It will always be just a temporary expression. Sri Aurobindo goes to great lengths to show that pain and suffering and death are not what they appear to be. And the whole principle of phenomenology is that nothing is what it appears to be. Everything is much more than what it appears to be. What anything appears to be at any particular time is not all of that which led up to what it now is, and it's not all of those things which are going to flow from what it is right now. But it actually is all of that to come and all of that which went before. So if we evolve the capacity of vijnana and ajnana that are the seeing and doing based upon the whole, then we won't be so inclined to do things for the sake of now or yesterday or tomorrow. We can put all of that on hold, and we can do things for the sake of the truth of things. You know, we can create an economy in Oroville which isn't dependent upon private property and money, if we want to. But in order to do that, we have to give up completely attachment to things. And if we are seeing ourselves in relation to all of time and space, then we have everything. So we can give up attachment to anything easily, because we already are everything and have everything. And that's exactly Sri Aurobindo's point of view in interpreting the Isha Upanishad. All of this is for that. It's not for us. And it is that. It's not us. We are just that. And we can surrender to that. And all of these faculties that have evolved can become expressions of that universal being that they in fact are in their individualized systemic development. Then how would the world look to us? Well, that's my time for the day.
Are you taking some questions or some comments?
Sure. Would you like to question?
I'm a little confused by your presentation. I'm a little confused by your presentation. It seemed very muddling to me. You said that from 1750 to 1850, this is the time our civilization was taking off. I know this is the height of rise of science in the Western world, but it is also the rise of imperialism in the West.
Empiricism, basically.
Imperialism.
Imperialism, right.
Yes, they roughshod all of Asia.
Yes, absolutely.
Asia, all of Africa. And there was the sense of morality, ethics, concern, and being. Where is it? Where do we hear it from any of the philosophers? The only philosopher who talked about it in England was Karl Marx, who talking about it, giving a new interpretation of class structure.
May I respond?
Can I just say a couple more things? Yeah. And so I find, this whole idea that it is that and it is this and that, and I just find, I don't know, do we have any sense of morality, ethics? And we have 2 world wars in the 20th century. Where does it all fit in your scheme of things?
Yes, would you like me to respond now?
Please.
No, I said that the empirical mind doesn't care who gets subjugated. It has no sense of the being of things themselves. According to the empirical mind, nothing has any reality in itself. So it's quite easy for the British to occupy and rape other countries, just as it's quite easy for animal researchers to plug monkeys' brains into nice, shiny chrome equipment and read the impulses that result from this or that stimulus. The empirical mind basically is not ethical. But there are other minds that have always been present. And so when Hegel comes along, and Marx after him, they say that we have the ability to judge between what is and what should be. And so Marx's Hegelian idea was that society is not just, and we need to correct it. But the positivists completely took over Hegelian and Marxist thought, and we've had positivism right up till today as the dominant philosophy of modern civilization. And that positivism is fundamentally empirical. And it totally justifies any form of government which succeeds in producing and reproducing a certain set of values at any particular time. And according to positivism, it has nothing to do with free will, it has nothing to do with right and wrong. If it's working, then it's the thing that we need to serve. So empiricism and positivism have been the dominant trends for the last 300 years. But German idealism and phenomenology and integralism have nonetheless emerged steadily during these 300 years. And they were there prior. And so they're on another cycle of emergence, these more holistic points of view. And if we take Sri Aurobindo, according to his own view of things, it's time for those holistic aspects of consciousness to become dominant again. Let's hope.
I don't agree with the gentleman. I think that the British Empire was very positive for India, because had we not spoken English, we would not have had Auroville, and we would have had your wonderful country.
That's a good positivist conclusion.
Okay, thank you very much, Rod. So once again, quite a different perspective. We started the morning with Vladimir sharing this sort of basic model around integral knowledge paradigms. We had Vladislav sharing his experience engaging this paradigm in teaching music. Now we've had a look through the lens of the philosophy of consciousness. And in a minute we'll move on and hear from Nishta, where he'll share about Vedic speech and the integral knowledge paradigm. But before we take that shift, let's take again a couple of moments just to let this perspective land. So if you can just turn your attention back onto what you've just heard and reflect on that. You may have some different perspectives. You may have heard something new, you may have confirmed things that you've heard before. But if you can just focus your attention on the philosophy of consciousness and integral knowledge paradigms, what have you taken out of that? What have been some of the gems that you've taken out of listening to what Rod shared? And what are some questions, some uneasiness, some uncertainty, some lack of clarity that you might still be sitting with? So let's take a few moments to reflect on that.